Equality is fine, inclusiveness is fine, but the idea of diversity is now being pulled away from, which has some very sort of uncomfortable feelings for us in the UK in terms of how we operate.
Hello and welcome to Beyond Borders. We're the podcast which looks at the exciting opportunity of how you take your business global. And we do this by speaking to a whole range of interesting people. Sometimes we speak to business owners that have done this before and we try to see what we can learn. Sometimes we speak to service providers that help us on the way and help block and tackle all those issues that we face. And sometimes we speak to just some really interesting people that we can learn from and listen to their stories. And I think today this chat probably ticks all of those boxes in some shape or form. And today I'm joined by Alistair McArthur, who is a partner and head of employment at Herrington Carmichael. And Herrington Carmichael are a leading UK law firm and best known for advising businesses on really complex employment legislation and compliance matters. And today we're going to dig into and explore the topic of ED&I, and especially from that US and EU aspects and how it's influencing the UK and how that's sort of impacting how we think about equality, diversity and inclusion. Now, we're not here to get political, neither of us want to do that. We're here to talk about the business challenges and the sort of risks and pitfalls and just share some lessons learned, really. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Alistair. Alistair, so welcome to Beyond Borders.
Hi, Andrew. Lovely to speak to you today. Thank you for the opportunity to come on to Beyond Borders. I've enjoyed the previous sessions. I saw the one from Josh and from Angus and thought to myself, this looks like a really exciting place to be. So thank you for letting me come and talk today.
Well, really appreciate it. So, well, you'll know then we like to start things off really easy. And so just give our audience a little bit of an overview of your background, your experiences, and how it clearly all led to the pinnacle of the career of being here today.
This is the definite pinnacle for me, Andrew. Thank you very much. So I'm a 20-year qualified lawyer as at this year. I was stunned when I saw the number come up and I was amazed that I'd hit 20 years. It's gone in the blink of an eye. I started back in the days of the Labour, of the very, very early phases of the Conservative government post-Labour. When we were in a world of employment law changes, I was doing predominantly work for individuals at that stage. I transitioned to work for corporate entities in 2006. And since then joined Herrington Carmichael in 2014, where I've led the team here. And we built a model which is very much solidly on relationships, on understanding our clients' needs and making sure we meet those needs as quickly and as effectively as we possibly can. We work for a range of organisations from different sizes. Most of them have an international presence of some element to them. I don't think you can be in business anymore if you're not thinking outside of your own country's borders, to be frank with you. So we see these influences and we see these things that are happening in every aspect of what we do. So it's a great topic to be talking on today.
Great introduction, and obviously, clearly, everybody can understand now why we thought you'd be a great guest, and Herrington Carmichael have a great range of clients and experiences that we can all learn today. So let's start with, what are you seeing day to day? How much influence do you think foreign decisions and those cultural trends are having on ED&I and the expectations around that for us here in the UK?
Much more so than you would expect, Andrew. I mean, we have a very, very settled set of UK law in relation to ED&I and equality in itself. But actually, we're seeing increasingly the world around us leaning into our law and trying to stop what we as businesses naturally think we should be doing or influence how we operate. It has a much greater impact than people would naturally expect, because ultimately, when we're in business, we're all here to try and satisfy our customers, satisfy the people we're working with. And we're working in a number of different environments where different people have different views, have different politics, different understandings, different cultures, in fact. And if we're so restricted and limited in our UK view, we find that we lose so much in terms of actually what is the important aspects for those people who we are in contact with all the time. So it has a huge effect on decision making, has a huge effect on trends in terms of how businesses are operating. And any business which is not looking outside of the UK environment will get left behind.
Yeah. Now. Okay. And so there's clearly a shift happening at the moment in the US around those corporate attitudes to EDI. How are UK businesses responding to that from what you can see?
This is a fascinating environment that we're in at this moment in time. There is a definite shift happening. US government orders were published earlier this year in terms of removing diversity inclusion initiatives in relation to areas where there was a perceived excessive expense or unnecessary cost. As a consequence of that, US organizations have started to pull back from their DE&I initiatives. We see that with Bank of America. We see it with Paramount. Bloomberg reckon that some 20% of US organizations have now pulled back from their equality and diversity initiatives. I mean, it's extraordinary. And as a consequence of that, what we see is with those companies and organizations in the UK where they have US ownership or US influence, they are now under pressure to remove elements of their policies and processes and how they operate, particularly the word diversity, which I find quite surprising because I'm very, very used to diverse environments and the benefit of diverse environments. Equality is fine, inclusiveness is fine, but the idea of diversity is now being pulled away from, which has some very sort of uncomfortable feelings for us in the UK in terms of how we operate.
Okay, so what probably started as an initiative to help businesses save cost is actually manifesting itself into something that's potentially far more dangerous?
I would agree with you. And certainly in terms of UK compliance and UK risks for organisations which have that element of US control or US ownership or US influence, we're now seeing a press to get rid of the idea of diversity out of training, out of policies, out of interaction. And having spoken with several of our clients in terms of where this applies, they're struggling with that. They find that very hard to actually balance in terms of how do they project themselves internally in the UK to meet what we see from a cultural UK perspective or from a policy perspective, but also meet that element of new change coming from the control and ownership. And what we're seeing is people quietly changing things, not necessarily doing it overtly at this stage, but changing things. And my concern, I think, would be how that affects decision-making, how that affects influencing, how that affects what we're telling the people on the ground as to what we as organisations will accept and what we will tolerate.
And it's, I have some experience of M&A internationally, merging with a US business, and then with that US business buying other businesses around the world. And cultural integration is the hardest thing to do in those scenarios anyway. And there's almost an issue here of don't forget what made the asset famous as well. You bought that asset because of its great diverse thinking style and its ability to sort of trailblaze and innovate, and then something that's sort of coming down that was attempted to do something else actually ends up destroying the value in that asset as well, which is quite hard to sort of fathom sometimes. And we said we wouldn't make this political, so let's not sort of make this too US focused. There's also elements of Europe that impact this as well. And if we think about some of the European legislation, then we have the EU Pay Transparency Directive, and we can already see that starting to have an impact, even for companies that are not headquartered there. So what are you seeing as those implications?
I think it's really a fundamentally important point, because the EU position is much more stringent and it's almost a dichotomy to the US position. I feel like we sometimes sit in the middle in the UK. What we're seeing those companies who have an element of EU representation now getting ready for EU pay transparency. And EU pay transparency goes so much further than our own pay gap reporting requirements in relation to gender at the current time and disability and race, which is to come. But these EU pay transparency rules go an awful lot further. And what we're seeing is clients now having to get ready for that if they have EU interaction or EU presence. And particularly where they have that, they have to get ready in terms of the level of report, the amount of information that has to be provided, what's going to go out there into the public domain. But what I've also found fascinating is those organisations where they're in a competitive environment, but they don't have an EU presence. So I have a couple of clients who don't have EU presence, but their competitors do, and they're watching what's happening in terms of the exposure, potentially in terms of information going out into the marketplace around pay and what people are earning and whether they're competitive or not. And do they actually have to match what's happening, even though they're not caught by it? So they create the same impression so that the employee or the marketplace look at them in the same way. And that influence is quite strong, in fact, in terms for organizations who just would never have even thought that you'd be caught by it. They're having to think about things which are just outside of our UK culture and outside of our UK rules, because there is no UK equivalent of the pay transparency rules coming other than our gender pay gap reporting as currently sits. But that is light compared to what is coming in the EU.
I mean, that's a really interesting angle, isn't it? That there's actually a commercial disadvantage if you have to comply with this, which is such an odd place to find yourself as a business leader that's trying to sort of be commercial and implement one strategy as well.
And I think you're absolutely right. I think as a business leader, you're sitting there and you're thinking, which laws am I actually complying with? Which rules have I actually got to think about? What you're actually thinking about is you're looking at your competitors and seeing what your competitors are doing and almost trying to match them or get ahead of them in terms of how you present yourself. And this is where that influence from outside of the UK plays so heavily into us as decision makers, because we are forced effectively to consider things which we otherwise would not necessarily have even had in the parameter of our view. It's very, very hard.
Yeah, that segues nicely to sort of, so in your view, do you think we're at risk of importing cultural narratives that don't fit our market, or we sort of ignore global trends that become compliant risks because of that?
Wow, what a question. I mean, that's a cracking question. It's a real dichotomy, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think we are at risk of importing cultural trends and imposing compliance requirements which we perhaps don't otherwise have, or which may slow us down. And I think we've got to, though, maintain what we see as acceptable culture in our organizations. What do we think is the culture that we as an organization want to have, that we want to project, that we want our people to buy into? That is crucial for me, because I think, the law is the baseline element. The requirement with the UK legislation environment in terms of our equality laws, ours is the baseline. Every business is entitled to go beyond that. They're entitled to look more about how they build their culture, how they develop themselves, and why people want to work for them, and how they attract that really good talent to come and work for them. So for me, culture is crucial, but we are at risk of trying to over-engineer it to achieve something which is outside of our realm of responsibility.
And that's really interesting when we look at the sort of dynamic between you and I here and how we think about this. So, from a sort of a CEO and a leadership perspective, I always start to think about this from a culture perspective. So what is the culture that I want to develop and have and sort of really influence within the organization that I run, that I think will be most suited to the strategy? And do you think it's becoming less about culture then and more about risk management?
I think it is becoming less about culture and more about risk management. I think you're absolutely right. But I think the difficulty is that balance is out of kilter, because I think if we get our culture right, generally our risk management becomes very, very easily. And I think sometimes now in our environments, we're too focused on how do we get the risk managed? How do we make sure we minimize that risk? And the reality is we actually want to make sure we get the culture sorted out, because that will take care of everything else. And, we act for a number of organizations who have excellent culture, who have really spent time investing in what are the values that are important to them? What is the impression that they want to create with their workforce? How do they keep their workforce engaged? And by doing that, actually, they've minimized their risk in terms of longer term problems, complaints, issues, grievances, claims. They manage that by making sure that they keep their people engaged. If you've got a good, engaged, happy workforce, you generally have a much lower risk environment.
Okay, so if we sort of recap, we've got this sort of US directive that's now sort of impacting the UK, as we do with most elements of popular culture, never mind compliance and risk. We've got EU directives. We've got the nuances of if a business is US owned, if it's European headquarters. And I imagine there's some business leaders sat here listening to this that just don't know where to start. And we like to give our listeners some really useful takeaways and top tips. And so how would you help them go about thinking about this?
So I think I would start by looking at my own organization. What have I got? What am I in control of? And what are the important things to me to present? And where do I start with that? I start with that by looking at the values of the organization I've got. Have I got a clear understanding of what we as an organization want to be and how we want to project ourselves? So start internally. I then look externally at my sector and my environment that I'm working in. And what is my sector saying to me about the different things that we need to think about? What's the environment in terms of the industry that I'm in? Because one industry is going to be very different to another. I would then look wider in terms of the legal requirements beyond that. And clearly, we've talked about the base UK requirements. That's what you must comply with when you're in business in the UK. But then as you stretch out of that, as you go outside of the UK, you've got to influence then beyond that. And that's how I'd project it almost like as a pyramid, starting with myself, looking at my sector, looking beyond to where I am from a legal perspective and a risk perspective.
And from a sort of overhead perspective, again, thinking about from the leadership angle now, more than comfortable and sort of looking internally and set out what I want to achieve. But I assume this is the real time to bring in experts as well to help with this. There's just too much to expect you to have that in your internal bench strength.
I would agree. I think external advice, decent early advice in terms of what are the risks for you, what are the parameters you need to look at, where are the things that you need to be thinking about. That is crucial, particularly if you're an organization in change or you're an organization in growth. And we love growth organizations, as I know you guys do, because we are one and you are one too. And actually growth, though, has to be managed on so many different levels. And actually taking that external advice, taking good counsel from professionals who have been there before is worth its weight in gold, Andrew.
Yeah,
absolutely.
No, and especially for businesses that are acquisitive or private equity backed, the amount of issues this can cause in due diligence processes going forward, if you've not taken the time to consider and do it right initially, you might think, well, we'll save a little bit of time and effort and money here, but then ultimately destroys shareholder value later down the line.
I completely agree with you. In an acquisitive environment, making sure you don't forget the culture and the culture you want to build is crucial. I mean, you and I probably sit here and we could list organizations that we've been involved in, where the transaction has looked brilliant, where we've completed it, where everybody's shot off into the new world, very, very excited. And someone's been running behind going, hang on a minute, what about the culture? Actually, you need to take the culture first. You've got to make sure you've got the people on board, because every organization needs the people that are within it. They need to keep them engaged and they need to keep them encouraged and enthusiastic about what they're working towards. Lose that culture, you lose the business, you lose the asset you've invested in.
Yeah, it's back to that don't forget what made them famous point. It's sort of it's something that I like to sort of keep in my mind's eye a lot when thinking about this. So we like to learn, and we like to sort of, as humans, never mind as listeners of Beyond Borders, we like to sort of look at other people and learn what happened. And so we, clearly don't betray any confidences. So you don't need to name people. But do you have any examples of businesses that you've seen do this really well, where even from your sort of position of experience, where you just go like, wow, that's the blueprint of how to do this?
Absolutely. I think I'm not going to betray any confidences. I can't. I'm not allowed.
Yeah.
but the fact is I see numerous organisations, both ones we act for and others which we come in contact with, or we see who get it absolutely right. And that is where they work out really who they go back to the point which we made about working out their organisation that they've got and their values and how they project those to people. By keeping the people on board through that process, they get it nailed on. You look at some of the large multinational corporations that we all know, we could all sit here and name, who are renowned for their culture. The reason they're renowned for that is because they work hard on it. They spend time in terms of projecting their image and protecting their values. So people feel a sense of ownership in the organization. Yeah. They feel a sense of belonging, and that is crucial. Build that culture of belonging and people will stay.
Yeah, and I assume the converse of that is where you've seen businesses really get it wrong, or the opposite, where that's not been at the forefront of the rationale, and it's almost been ignore the culture, focus on EBITDA maximization, cost cutting, full on integration, and sort of before you know it, it's just too late, both from a compliance and a culture perspective.
I think it jumps on you before you expect it, but it's too late. I completely agree with you. And I think a little bit of investment early on in terms of that professional advice saves so much cost later on down the line. If you get it right to start out with, you, as we talked about, you minimize your risk exposure, which frankly is bad business for me as a lawyer, because we like the distressed purchase. Of course we do. But the reality is that I would rather be working with organizations at the front end to make sure they get it right to start out with and avoid the issues coming their way, because that's where we add value. That's where we bring benefit. It's, it's not so much fun or enjoyable where we're dealing with the problems at the other end.
Yeah. Okay. No, really interesting, really interesting points. And it's a sort of, I sort of go back to that. That's why you need the experts involved to help you through this, across compliance, legal, multiple regulatory environments. As a business leader, you can own what good looks like from a cultural perspective, but then actually how to implement and manifest that against multiple regions. Got to sort of get that team around you to help you do that well. Okay, Alistair, so we've now reached the part of the podcast where we enter into our quickfire questions. Some guests don't hear the quickfire bit, so try and keep the quickfire part. So just fire some questions, shoot from the hip. So biggest global influence on UK ED&I right now?
Definitely the European influence of what we're seeing. We're seeing that much more. It coming into organisations once again while we work through our Brexit conundrums.
Yeah. Okay. No, really useful. Okay. Is pay transparency going to become standard in the UK?
Not yet. Okay. Give me 10 years and probably yes.
Yeah. And for those people sort of sat on the fence now saying, I know this is on my to-do list. I know I need to get better at this. Is it more dangerous saying and doing nothing, or saying the wrong thing?
Always doing nothing. Or if you don't do anything at all, you're stuffed before you've even started.
And given all the change we've talked about today and what you can see coming down the sort of pipeline as well, will boards be more or less vocal on EDI over the coming years?
Personally, I hope for more than being more vocal in the coming years. I fear for less vocal.
Yeah. So. And in that sort of future gazing then, if the sort of one piece of advice, if people want to try and stay ahead of this curve, what would that be?
We've talked about it already, and I'll say it again, getting that basic parameters of what you as an organization see as your values and culture right, and doing it sooner rather than later.
Excellent. Well, that has been a really useful conversation. It's one that's politically charged. It's really sensitive. It's massively nuanced, and from a business leader perspective, it's the most important thing to make sure that the culture of that organization manifests itself as well. So I hope people listening have found this really useful. So if I sort of play back what we've learned or what we've talked about, and then feel free to add and correct me as we go. So I think it really highlights that we can no longer sort of think about our ED&I policy in isolation. It's a much bigger part now of a business sort of change program, strategy program, and it's been shaped by policy. It's been shaped by sort of public discourse, legal frameworks, European legislation, US, and it's really hard for UK businesses and complicated for us to sort of understand what's real and what's not, and how to stay ahead of that curve. And I think the advice is to understand what's important to you, to internalize first, and to make sure you understand what that sort of diversity and inclusion means, and then surround yourselves with the right talent and experience and service providers to help, one, implement that vision, but two, make sure that you're kept abreast of changes that are coming down the pipeline as well.
I completely agree. Spot on, Andrew. I think you've nailed it.
Excellent. So, well, listen, thank you so much for that. If there's anybody listening to this that either would like to speak to you or Herrington Carmichael, where can they easily find you?
We are everywhere. So you can find us at herringtoncarmichael.com. I'm Alistair.McArthur at hc.law. I'd always love to talk to people. It's one of the benefits, Andrew, of having a very, very identifiable name. You can find me pretty much anywhere.
And you know, it won't be too much of a plug. I think everybody can see today that that's just a really genuine conversation that sort of helps business leaders understand it. I'd highly recommend people to reach out to Alistair and the firm if they feel they need to. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you very much for being an excellent guest and sharing some really useful insights. And for everybody, until next time, keep pushing beyond borders. Thank you very much.